Welcome to UNB Light Lens. Today I am Nabila Rahman, who will be hosting a very special Light Lens with our very special guest, Mr. Krish Srinivasan. He is the former Indian Foreign Secretary and also the Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth Nations. Welcome on board.
Thank you.
He also has a degree from Oxford and joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1959. He was posted in many countries as a diplomat as well as an ambassador in Libya, Zambia, Nigeria, Netherlands, and Bangladesh. He has written 8 books on international relations and is a regular columnist, and he also does book review in Indian newspapers. So, welcome to Bangladesh again.
Thank you.
It is very nice to have you again with us. You've lived here for quite some time before.
Yes, as High Commissioner.
As
yes.
High Commissioner, and which year was that?
That was in 1989 to 1992.
Oh, nice. So a lot has changed. Have you been after that?
I have been about maybe half a dozen times because
nice.
I came here from the Commonwealth as a part of my duties as a political head of the Commonwealth. And I think I came twice in that connection, and I've been here for book launches and lectures after that, maybe half a dozen times or so.
So very good, very good. So you're very familiar, obviously,
Yes,
with our country,
reasonably.
of course. And so we'll just get back to why we are here today. So we wanted to understand, how do you see the breakdown of the so-called liberal world order? Can nation states survive in a state of disorder as we appear to have now?
Well, I don't know whether the part of the world which considers itself to be liberal would say that it's a breakdown, because I think they would consider that their values are eternal and universal and still hold good. So I don't think that they would necessarily consider it a breakdown. I think the question that you're asking is probably predicated on the fact that you've had several governments who've been elected democratically, but who have turned out to be, let's say, populist nationalist, or perhaps not following precisely the liberal traditions of Western countries. So I think that your question probably derives from the fact that you see in, let us say, the last 10 or dozen years, the growth of fairly illiberal governments in many countries in the world, not only in the West, but also in the non-West. And your assumption is that that's a process or progress which is going to continue. I think that's challengeable, because the countries you're referring to have periodic elections. They have, therefore, changes of government. And while, for the time being, you've had leaders who follow a very nationalistic viewpoint, I don't think it's necessarily so that they're going to be there indefinitely. So I think that it's more likely that the pendulum will swing again, and it may not, of course, swing back to a completely liberal order. It may, in fact, continue to swing in the other direction. But these movements in international politics tend to be not permanent. They tend to be cyclical. And so I wouldn't say that the liberal order is completely vanquished. Incidentally, I think that liberalism also is a phenomenon which is growing in certain parts of the world. So it's not only that populist nationalists are coming to the fore, it's also that several countries which have perhaps been more autocratic in the past have become liberal more recently. I could cite some examples, but I think you prefer to deal with this in general terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can feel free to tell the audience more if you want to give some examples. I think it'll shed some lights.
Well, I think that in terms of nationalist populist governments which have emerged through the democratic process, one could start, of course, with the home of liberalism in a way, which is USA. And many would say that Mr. Trump represents a new model of government there, a model which depends very largely on leverage rather than values. And they would say that Mr. Trump's America First doctrine is something relatively new and which calls for adjustment on the part of other countries to American policies. This is also a tendency in Europe. There are certain countries there. There has been a populist nationalist government in Rome, in Italy, in Hungary, in Austria. And I think that in Poland, and I think that people have recognized this as being perhaps a result of frustrations on the part of the populations of those countries because of inequality, basically because of inequality and because people felt they didn't have a voice to express their own frustrations. In a way, also, Britain also falls into that category with the latest election of Mr. Boris Johnson. Many would consider that the whole Brexit process is a product of nationalist and populist reaction. And turning to Asia, of course, you have countries here in this part of the world also which show those tendencies. But as I say, these could be temporary phenomena.
Very good. And since you just brought Brexit, we have a question regarding that, just to keep up with the flow. Since you've been a Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, do you think Brexit would now heighten the UK's interest in strengthening the Commonwealth?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a stated intention of Britain to not only fall back on, but to maybe even depend on the old Commonwealth relations, the old Commonwealth connections, to counteract and to balance the losses from the European market. Now, it's not going to be that easy for Britain to do this after a fairly long pause when the Commonwealth perhaps felt it was neglected or partly neglected by Whitehall, which is the centre of the British government. But that is the intention, that's the stated intention. And certainly as far as the Commonwealth countries are concerned, they would have no objection whatsoever if Britain took a greater interest and a stronger part in the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth, like many international organizations, does need re-energizing. And Britain being, quote unquote, the mother country of the Commonwealth, is the right country in many ways to do the re-energizing of the Commonwealth.
Absolutely.
The head of the Commonwealth, is the Queen or the Monarch of Britain.
Yeah, it's England. So another important thing, that we can also look at is your thoughts about the future interstate cooperation in South Asia. For example, do you think SAARC that we had in South Asia can be revived, and do you think it would be worthwhile?
I think the great difficulty in SAARC was that right from the time of its inception, we had the problem of Pakistan-India relations looming over this organization. And it became prey or subject, if you like, to relations between 2 or 3 member countries, which were not ideal for moving forward on a cooperative basis. This was the great danger right from the beginning. And before the complete breakdown, due to the India-Pakistan relationship, we've had long pauses also before summit meetings could take place because of that difficulty of a bilateral relationship obstructing progress in the multilateral institution. Now, I think certainly SAARC didn't make as much progress as we thought it would do when it was started in 1986 in Dhaka, as a matter of fact. But on the other hand, it didn't do certainly any damage to countries who are members. So while its beneficial qualities might have been not so clear, there was no negative fallout from SAARC at all. There were some agreements within SAARC countries that were not implemented by all countries. There were some very good agreements within SAARC which weren't able to take off at all because one or other countries wouldn't sign up to them. So these were the drawbacks in many ways. But on a people-to-people level, I think that people got much more conscious of the fact that they were South Asians as opposed to let us say, Sri Lankans or Nepalese or Bhutanese. So I think that was the beneficial aspect of it. Speaking of the future, we had an expansion of SAARC by inclusion of Afghanistan, for example. But we've had no retractions, or let us say, we've had no minuses. We've had pluses, but no minuses. No country has ever left SAARC so far, which is a good thing. What we have now is a suspension of activity, particularly the summit activity, because of the relationship between India and Pakistan. We can only hope, therefore, that one day when relations are better and have improved, that SAARC will be regenerated, and that the process of institutional arrangements will continue as before. Candidly, for the time being, I don't see a great deal of optimism in this. But it's not the only institution in the world which is multilateral and having difficulties. Many have difficulties in terms of energy. Many have difficulties in terms of budget, and many have, let us say, rather a poorer track record than SAARC. So I'd just like to be hopeful about it, and hope that the leaders of our countries will regard SAARC as a useful instrument of sub-regional cooperation, which is worth reviving, even if it's not at the summit level, at the official and people level. And I think that's perhaps an easier way to go.
So absolutely, I think there's so much potential. And again, that, when we were talking about Commonwealth, again, that feeling of, belonging for all these countries together for a common purpose or goal and a vision, maybe refreshing the vision of when SAARC started in 86 to now. I mean, a lot has changed, right? And India and Pakistan is still going to be there as one of the member countries. But I think that vision and the purpose and being in a community or those countries together, like what EU have, and now with Brexit, is a different change, especially for England. So I think there's a lot of potential, and we can only hope, because that's all we can do.
Yes, if I can say, to add to what you said, I think you're perfectly right. I think that the situation now in 2020 is very far different from what it used to be in 86. And some countries have made enormous progress in that period. I would say
including Bangladesh.
I would say especially Bangladesh has made enormous progress. And so you could say the variables in this organization, the pluses and minuses, have changed quite considerably. And Bangladesh, of course, I think it's worth pointing out, is the center of two other organizations that have subsequently taken place. And one is BIMSTEC, and the other is BBIN. And so while I'm not suggesting in any way that these organizations are counter to or antagonistic to SAARC, I'm just trying to suggest that, to back up what you said, that the balances of 1986 have changed considerably, and weightages in different directions now.
Absolutely. So another bigger power that has come is obviously China and its views, and so they're doing the BRI. And so what are your views on China's Road and Belt Initiative? And do you see the possibility of a future Indian involvement?
Well, that's a very important question. And I think that I have to stress here that I speak as an individual and not on behalf of any government. And I think I need to make that clear, because there are different schools of thought on BRI. BRI stands for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a Chinese worldwide project and largely financed by and authored by China. Now, I think of all the countries that have been, let us say, involved in the BRI and who have opposed it, India perhaps is the only one. So your question is completely valid, being posed to an Indian. But as I said, there are many opinions on this. And there are those who think that the BRI is harmful. Not only would it be harmful to India, but harmful to the countries who are participating in it at the moment. Briefly speaking, because it's a greater benefit to China than those countries. And secondly, because of the finances which come from China, which have to be repaid. Repaid at a certain time, and with certain conditionality, and that's going to impose a tremendous debt burden on those countries. Now, this is basically the negative view. But the positive view is that it provides for far greater interconnectivity for these countries, not only in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of digital connectivity and, let us say,
I would also think trade.
absolutely right, and also the global value chains, because it is possible to generate far greater manufactures by the use of global value chains, global supply chains, and the establishment of free ports, for example, free industrial zones. And this is a part of the much wider concept. So I think that there are many positive aspects. It is for each country, frankly, to decide on its own. It's not necessarily so that country X has to be advised by country Y as to whether BRI is good for it or not. It can take its own decision whether the communications and the connectivities provided by BRI are good for that country, and whether the price to pay in terms of the loans, the debts, is something which is going to be manageable or not. So it's a difficult question that you've asked. I think it's for each country to decide, but you've asked me for my personal view. Now, but my personal view is, if BRI succeeds in tremendous interconnectivity, not only in regionally, sub-regionally, and intercontinentally, because the whole idea is to link Asia with Europe also, and not only by land, but also by sea. Furthermore, moving to Africa, even to Latin America, I think that it's going to be a tremendous game changer in the world. And I think that whether one is with it or one is not with it, it's a process that has to be followed and assessed very, very carefully. And this BRI project could be the biggest new thing in the world and in international politics in this century.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah.
I take it that you are in support of it.
I have to look at the numbers. I have to see the rate of investment and the rate of return and the loans and the interest rate. I haven't done my numbers yet. I hope the government is doing their numbers.
I think you seem to be sitting on the fence here. But assuming all those things are favorable, or at least not unfavorable, I think that it would be a tremendous asset to any country.
Absolutely. So it's about the numbers and how much trade, how much regional cooperation, travel, everything.
Yes.
And, maybe visa-free access. I don't know. There could be a lot of things that can happen by land, by sea, that is not happening, that can have favorable aspect to different countries based on the different bilateral, multilateral ties they have with each other.
Yes.
And again,
I think the apprehensions of some countries is that BRI places China in a key position in regard to this entire global project, and that makes them feel apprehensive. And it's a country which one cannot but admire, but which has throughout history not been fully understood. And therefore, I think that countries would like to begin with a greater understanding, or the negative countries would like to begin with a greater understanding of the bona fides, if you like, the good faith of the Chinese government before they proceed to view this project positively.
Okay, very good. I guess time will tell. And moving
as with so many things.
As with everything. You are obviously committed to values being a key driver of foreign policy. Do you think values in domestic policy also have an impact on foreign policy?
I think there is a distinction between the two, because I think values in domestic policy are rarely actually spoken about, because they're taken for granted. Values in foreign policy are important, not because they are pursued diligently or because they're observed punctiliously by all countries, but because it's a yardstick by which you can judge nations' actions. And I think that has great merit, because by what other standards can you actually assess whether a country is successful or not. It's successful not only because it benefits a country's personal interests and it's advantageous to a particular country, but if it's got to have moral standing, if it's got to have an ethical basis, it's much easier to compliment a country and look positively on its actions. And there, only values plays a part. And you've got to assess these values, the failure or success of them, by the values enunciated by that country itself, because one country's values are not going to be the same as another's. So I do think, yes, while it's true that values are frequently flouted, I think it's also important to understand what that value system is in order to judge its success.
Very good. What is your take on the current state of Indo-Bangladesh relations? In your view, would recent legislations in India have an impact on it?
Well, the first part of your question, my view is benign, in the sense that I think that relations between India and Bangladesh are much better now than when I was the High Commissioner, for example, and probably better than any subsequent period to my being here, which was in the early 90s up to now. And I would say that on nearly all, by nearly all yardsticks, there's a tremendous improvement in relationship. I think not only the cordiality between the governments, but also between the peoples. The media in India is full of praise for Bangladesh at the moment, which is something rather new. And everybody in India realizes that Bangladesh has made fantastic progress, especially in the social and human sectors, and advances far beyond India in this respect. In terms of the legislation you mentioned, this is relating, I think, to citizenship, though you didn't spell it out. If you have something else in mind, please let me know.
Right.
If you're speaking of citizenship, I'm afraid I can't give you a short answer, because these are intensely complicated matters. There are three aspects to this citizenship question, and if you permit me to just take a minute, I'd say that the first aspect is the fast tracking of citizenship for certain minority communities in three countries. They are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And these minority communities are basically Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and so on. And they are fast tracked in the sense that they're going to be given citizenship in 5 years rather than 11 years, if they can prove that they were discriminated against in those three countries. But that doesn't exclude people who don't belong to those religions from getting citizenship. It's just that they have to wait longer. So as I said, one is a fast-track process and one is a normal process. Okay. The second aspect is one of the National Citizenship Register, which I think is something you're probably referring to quite accurately. This took place only in one state in India, which is Assam, and it proved a dreadful failure. It's a failure that's been recognized by all the political parties in India and basically given up. They'll have to do it all over again. And if they're going to do this in every state in India, I'd just like to say three things quickly. One is that 9 states in India have already said that they're not going to accept it. That may be overruled, but it's going to be very difficult to implement such a proposal when a state is opposed to it, because ultimately it's got to be done at the house-to-house level. The second thing I'll say is that we can't afford it, because it costs an enormous amount of money just in Assam. Then to transfer it to all the other states in India is going to be beyond our budgetary capacity. The third thing I want to say is that the Prime Minister of India has said absolutely clearly that it's not going to happen. It's not going to go ahead, because they realize the difficulties, and they realize also that assuming that you have a register of citizens and assuming that you find a lot of people who are not citizens, what are you going to do with them? Absolutely. And the government of India has already given an assurance, for example, to Bangladesh, saying that it's not going to be affected. So if anyone is found, let us say, who might have, mind you, because there's nothing positive about it, might have come from Bangladesh, he or she is not going to be repatriated to Bangladesh. So he or she is going to be in India. But that's going to be also an impossible situation because he or she will be stateless. And while stateless people have certain rights, they also have certain limitations. So I think that this is a hornet's nest, if you forgive that expression, which India cannot possibly afford to have.
Very good. There's a lot of complicated and there's a lot of rules and laws that keeps, changing and getting implemented, and we hear a lot of things and there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of changes. And with this whole global context, I mean, what we read is what we get, and these explanation helps us understand better from the state of mind of where India is coming from, though it's very complex. And so I hope our audience got a good glimpse today of, because we touched upon a variety of topics from India to SAARC to Commonwealth to Brexit. I mean, these are very heavy topics. These are very complicated goals and visions of the leaders of the different countries, but we are all trying to align ourselves and make a better world. So hope we have a more peaceful world. Thank you so much for coming to our show, for being here with us. We've learned enormously. If you want to say any last thing to our audience who will be watching you, please go ahead, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, UNB, for allowing me to appear on your program.